All right, ladies and gentlemen, ready to go. Welcome to the 2 p.m. panel, which is formally titled Managing Digital Change, but I really wanted to change the title to Esra and Friends, because we've got a really nice panel of 4 ex-BBC people, plus Mark at the end down there. So I'm going to just go through really quick introduction and just tell you who we have here. The way that it's going to work is we've got about 75 minutes, so we're going to run through some question and answers, which is going to be more like a conversation rather than your typical panel. We want to make this fun because it's after lunch and some of us may or may not have had a few glasses of wine at lunch, so as will you. And in the last 15 minutes we may or may not take a nap. So I'd like it to be really informal. To my left, I have Anne-Marie Tomchak, formerly of the BBC, but now the UK editor of Mashable. Next to her is Matt Danzico, who's also responsible for starting up the Instagram account for BBC News and BBC Pop-Up. And then he set sail over the Atlantic to set up the first digital studio at NBC called NBC Left Field. And if you're feeling bored with this panel, you should get on Facebook or Twitter and check out what he's doing right now. So, right now. So,
under the table.
Next to Matt is Inga Thordar, who spent 15 years at the BBC and is now executive editor of CNN International. And then all the way down the end is Mark Littell, who some of you may know from being the famous person behind Storyful, who then sold it on to News Corp, went over to Twitter after a long career in Irish public broadcasting, and now you're working on a dream project with Anya Kerr called Neva Labs. All right, so the first question that I want to ask for this panel, and maybe I should actually give you guys a background as to where this came about. A lot of us were at a conference last year, and one of the sessions that we went to, the topic that came up was, how do you manage digital change? How do you stop talent from leaving organizations? And why do leaders burn out? And that conversation has just continued and taken many different shapes and forms. And so I wanted to kind of get behind the thinking of, on this panel, I've got a great set of leaders, and they've all come to these positions because they're competent and very good at what they can do. But there are also things that we don't typically talk about, and one of those things is resilience. Nice segue into my first question, which I'm going to ask to all of you guys, is what is your favorite failure? And another way to rephrase it would perhaps be, what is something that, what was perhaps a failure but set you up for future success? Matt, you look like you really want to answer this question.
I was just thinking about it as I was on my way over here, because I knew that Esra was going to ask this question. I was just thinking, man, I fail constantly. Like, I failed to get here on time, and you all saw it. Like, I am in a constant, perpetual state of failure. So when thinking about, like, what is my favorite failure, like, just take the past 10 minutes alone. I couldn't even get into the bathroom just now, and it was open. I failed at that. Like, so I guess, like, my... It's a long story that I won't get into right now.
You're failing to answer the question.
Yeah, I'm failing as we speak. So I guess my point is that, you know, failure makes me stronger no matter how cliche it is. And every project I complete, I think, wow, I did not do that in the way that I had intended, or it could have been done the best. So when I think about, like, my favorite failure, again, like, take the past week. Like, every single project I work on, every video edit, I don't know, down to, like, every single email I send, I think afterwards, man, it could have been better. But I guess that's what makes us stronger and strive for sort of better things in the future over and over and over again.
So from Matt, I'm going to jump down to Mark, because Mark, you've been involved in
so many failures.
Well, I'm going to say that, but many interesting escapades, shall we say. What's your favorite failure?
Well, I'm kind of like Matt. I mean, I have a group of friends of mine. I remember this thing called the Web Summit, and they had a founders group, the elite founders of tech startups in Dublin, and all the Irish startups were excluded. So we founded a group called the Flounders, which is dedicated to failure. And our motto is Sam Beckett's great line from Wordsworth Ho, where he says, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. And that's literally something that it's the only kind of mantra that I've ever brought into my kind of leadership training. I suppose for me, the biggest failures have been it's personal. This is a panel, I think, this is deeply personal. No matter what you do in terms of your leadership, in change, in organizations, in my case, I've had public services, I've had a startup, I worked for Rupert Murdoch and then Jack Dorsey. So I kind of have seen organizations in different forms. And the single failure I think that I would have is when I was at Storyful, I thought that the role of a leader was to be a sponge for the anxieties of the group around you. So when you ask people in a startup to go with you, it's an act on their part of madness. You've got a clear vision. As a leader, you've got to have empathy, radical empathy. You've got to have self-awareness. You've got to have impulse control. And I thought the fifth element was, I got to make sure everyone in this room is okay every day, and I'll soak up all the anxiety as a consequence of that. So they won't have to worry when they come in to do something that's already very risky. They put their backing behind me. It became insufferable for me personally, and it led me to a biggest mistake where I didn't really understand the difference between cash flow in a business and having like revenue in your bank account. And I ended up having one day to lay off 5 staff out of 25, including a friend of mine who'd been a friend of mine for 20 years. And I literally had to arrange seats in the office so that everyone had the fairness of knowing they were laid off from the company at the same time. And for me, it was a profound failure. And that night, the rest of the staff brought me out for drinks, and they came up to me at the end. This one young guy came to me and said, you know, you've changed my life, what would you have done here? But can I just say to you, we don't need to be protected. And from then on, I embraced a sense of, as much as possible, radical transparency about when we were going through bad times and good times. And if people trusted me more, people, I think, had a better sense of confidence in the business because they knew that I wasn't trying to soak up the anxieties and treat them like children. So out of that mistake, which I'm not proud of, by the way, I tell that story and I fucked up, and people suffered because of it. So I'm not saying it is a great story to show how I learned, but I'm just saying it was a turning point for me as a leader and a turning point for the business as well. We had much more people stayed with us, I think, longer because of that radical transparency.
From one side of Ireland, I'm jumping to the other. And Marie.
So I suppose, yeah, I would think of failure in some similar terms to yourself. I've only really been a leader in the technical sense for the last 2 years or thereabouts, leading Mashable's UK team. But Matt Danzico and I, in 2013, we worked really closely together, and we were piloting a new format for the BBC, which is now known as BBC Trending. And I guess like the idea at that time was just to go completely rogue, would you say? We were like this kind of guerrilla startup within the BBC. And I think that was a huge success. But what I would say is one of the things I really learned from that was that I had this then expectation that everything that I was going to do after that was going to be a success. And I think that was a failure or a learning. The next project I ended up working on, I was piloting mobile video formats for the BBC for their digital current affairs unit. And I think it was a failing of mine to expect that it was suddenly going to become this huge brand and this big outlet, the same as BBC Trending was. And part of the reason that it didn't succeed or that it wasn't like launched was because actually we learned an awful lot. And I think in some ways that's actually as much of a success. It's as much knowing what direction you're not going to go in and what projects you're not going to invest in. You can pull the plug on the project right near the edge of the line when you're just about to launch. And I think like knowing and having the instinct about doing that is really, really important. And then just to pick up on something Mark said, about having this shield around you and feeling that as a leader you need to always project this sense that you're very, very strong or that you always know the answer. I think that that's something that I've had a tendency to do, and not showing vulnerability. And I think that when you're dealing with a team, you need to build up so much trust with them, and there's nothing wrong with showing vulnerability now and again. If you are having a difficult time or if you're observing what's going on, it's okay. And I think that that really builds trust amongst your team, that you're really trusting each other and you're leaning on each other when you need to. And I would say I would have managed down really well, but then also really failed to manage up. I would really put on the shields then when it came to talking to my boss, and I think that's a really big mistake. Now I have a new boss, and one of the first conversations I had with him on my one-on-one was like a really personal, frank conversation, and it set the tone for the type of relationship that I have with him now. And I feel like I'm building an extremely strong relationship, one that is, not always just about what's going on in the business or what we're doing with the editorial, but how am I or how are you? And I know that sounds very trite, but it's incredibly important when you're building relationships with people and you want to work with them and trust them.
I sort of, I sympathize with most of the views here and what Matt is saying, you know, when you sort of feel like you're constantly failing at something, I think there's something in that. I mean, we've all failed to get jobs, for better or for worse, as it turned out. You know, we've all felt that launching a product or something we launched didn't kind of work out. But I think that sort of, you know, what maybe categorizes most of my failures is that I genuinely, absolutely fail at following rules. I am very bad at following rules. And having been at a BBC which is built on rules and then moving on to another legacy organization, it does get me into trouble quite often. And
was it seek permission, ask for forgiveness later?
Yeah, it's a little bit like that. But I think that if you know, I mean, I look at myself as somebody who needs to come in and change things, and because of that, you know, letting go of the rules is a good thing. But I guess if I can, you know, categorize my failures a little bit in terms of sort of biggest failures, always have to do with people as a leader, you know. So when I have failed to secure a contract or a sponsorship that would have kept people in their jobs, that is always something that I take really personally and really badly and affects me. If you're talking about my favorite failure, something that led to something good, I think I'd definitely say my complete failure at managing up at the BBC, which led me to leaving in the end. At the moment, that is my favorite failure.
All right, so we're in Italy, so we're speaking quickly in English, but we've been asked to speak slowly.
Okay.
All right, so we'll try to do that and give the interpreters in the back a break. We're just really excited to be here. So there's a few topics that I want to cover. A lot of it does center on leadership because we have maybe students in the room looking to get into journalism. We have people who are maybe more digitally native in the places that they work. And then, as we've seen from some of the other sessions today, we have also leadership in traditional or legacy media organizations that are constantly trying to evolve to the nature of the evolutions also within the system. And so my next question is actually, maybe it's a two-pronged one. I want to know what's the best or worst leadership advice that either you've been given or you've given to somebody else. I like this, everyone's been thinking about it. And then I would also like to know what are some bad recommendations that you as a leader and others working in digital should avoid? And that could be include like what people or people's advice should you ignore? And maybe even what bad advice have you been given? So, Mark, would you like to kick things off?
So yeah, I think what I realized about early on was that there's a very big difference between a good manager and a good leader. You know, a good manager is a person that you feel knows what they're doing. And a good leader is someone who makes you feel that you know what you're doing. And it's sort of that idea of pushing the power down, you know, to allow you to essentially devolve the decision-making in a way that everyone feels like they're actually part of the same team. So that's the good advice I got. The bad advice I got was people who talk a lot about family. We're a family, you know, we're a team. You're not a family. So I remember my COO at one time, myself, in Storyful, we were 10 people, and we spent 3 weeks trying to, you know, get the business to a point, and I wrote a note saying how I was so proud of our family, and he wrote me a note back and he said, "You're not my family. My family is my kids who I didn't see last weekend. Don't use that word again." So I learned a lot from Reid Hoffman, who's the founder of LinkedIn, who talks about allyship. The idea that we're almost, and I hate wartime analogies when it comes to leadership, but this one works, where we're on a mission together. We may become closer than other members of my family. We may get, you know, into the trenches together and do something special, but don't talk about me as family. What that allowed me to do, the biggest test, I think, I went to Twitter. I joined Twitter on a day, I think, when the stock price fell by about 20%, which was I hope is a coincidence. But I then managed a team of 250 people in Dublin, the international headquarters for Twitter, and a team of 40 around Europe. And so I had to get up every Friday at what they call tea time. And every week for the year I was there, it was a pretty tough time for Twitter financially and for other reasons. And I had to get up and give a rallying call every Friday. So the first time I got up and I said, "I'm so excited to be here," and I continued on, and a guy took me aside and said, "We've been told how excited leaders are on Twitter. Don't tell people you're excited. You've got to come up in an authentic way to not use the word 'I'm so excited by this challenge.'" So I sat down, I talked to a few people. Learning development in Twitter was a big thing. And I came up with a mantra for me, which is I said, every Friday, I'm going to ask you the same question. If you feel you can answer all 4 questions or 3 questions in the affirmative, you should stay here and work with us and work together. And the first one was, do you believe in the product? Yes. Do you believe in the vision for where we're going? Do you believe in your team, and do you believe in the people who lead those teams? Now, you can say no to one of those questions. I'd urge you to stay. But if you can say yes to all those questions every week that I stand up here, we're going to be okay. And so the consistency of that every week to sort of test the ground every week. And some people did leave, not very many. But I think that's the thing I came out of that knowing, that the best advice we'll ever get would be absolutely consistent in your leadership. Never be too excited about something one day and then very down the next day. Because that level of volatility is something that people pick on very quickly. And if you're going to be excited one week, you can't sustain being excited, 52 weeks of the year. And people will get that lack of authenticity. So that was kind of the thing I learned from being with Twitter. And it was the best bunch of people, smartest bunch of people. And I had actually probably, ironically, the best year of my life as a leader inside Twitter because of that learning.
Yeah. I'm going to actually jump from you to Matt because the word family came up. So when I was at the BBC leading World Service YouTube, we actually did call ourselves a family. And I think it was because we maybe had the reputation of being some rogue elements within an organization who were seen as, the outlaws or the outsiders. And so it was a way for us to bring it together. And that did work for us. And Matt, if you don't mind, so you were talking about how you lead your weekly team meetings and maybe referring to those as a family. Do you want to chip in next and maybe tell us about that? And what are some of the bad recommendations maybe that you've heard as a leader, or even bad recommendations that you've given? I think it's always good to talk about these things that you don't typically hear about on these panels.
So a couple things. One is those non-meetings I have. Ezra and I joke around a lot because when I was at the BBC, I told them I'm going on an indefinite meeting hiatus. She says strike. I remember it as hiatus. Ezra, I don't know. But basically, I found that I am a believer that meetings, you need a very clear agenda before you ask for my time, and I feel that way both about when I'm contacted by bosses and when I'm contacted by my employees. So what we do at work is every Monday we sort of sit around in a circle, almost like we're getting ready to play Duck, Duck, Goose, which is a popular American game that we all enjoy. And we sit around in a circle and we basically just tell each other what we have done that weekend. And that's the first thing that we discuss when we come to work to start the week, because I think it's really important for my employees to view each other as friends and or at least individuals whom they can speak to openly. And I think that really lays the groundwork for our relationship. So my feelings differ slightly from Mark's, but it's all sort of what works for you in your individual setting and environment. This may or may not relate to sort of the best advice that I've ever heard. I was just thinking about, there is actually one very clear sentence that comes to mind when I think about the best advice I ever heard. And ironically, it's from a friend who has not done that well professionally in the same industry, but his advice was to me, pretend to be something until one day you are it. And I genuinely followed that, and I sort of told everybody that I was a great documentary filmmaker and great reporter when I was just absolutely a pile of garbage. And eventually I got people like the BBC to believe me and believe that I actually knew what I was talking about when I was leading some of these teams. Even now, it's a bit of a lie. But, I think that's really important. And that was definitely the best piece of advice. Because at the end of the day, no matter whether you're sitting in an audience or you have a panel later on, we're all kind of living this lie. Anybody who truly feels that they are a great mind, an authority on journalism, they're just lying through their teeth, man. We're making this up. Come on, And so I think that was a really good piece of advice. The worst piece of advice that I ever got was, well, there were several. It all started with my parents telling me to go to college. I would say, I am here to tell you to question the system. I did not go to journalism school. I still haven't decided if I even like journalism, to be completely honest with you. I think the path for me and the path for, I'm sure, some of you is to question the system and just jump on immediately what you want to do today, tomorrow, or 2 days from now, a week from now, whenever. I guess when I wanted to become a journalist, my boss at the time said, well, you'll have to start, paying your dues. You could become a researcher for a couple of years and then eventually start breaking out into breaking news writing. You could do that for a little bit and then get in. No, like I wanted to become a features writer right then before I worked in video. And so I did. And how I did it was by just reading books on the topic. How I got involved in video was watching 11-year-olds on YouTube sort of discuss video editing techniques. By the way, 11-year-olds on YouTube literally know everything, I will say. But so I guess that's, the piece of bad advice that I got was to sort of throw me into the system, whether it was, going to college for a degree that I may not have wanted, or it was being told to go to journalism school or actually just sort of pay my dues at a company. I do not believe in it. I believe in 11-year-olds on YouTube, so that's my piece of advice for you.
Well, I can certainly remember the worst advice I was given. I was sort of a very ambitious senior broadcast journalist at the BBC at the time, and I was applying for my first editor's role, which I didn't get. I came back for feedback, sort of thinking I was doing the right thing, and he said, let me give you advice for your future. He said, you are never going to get anywhere at the BBC, and the reason is you kiss downwards and kick upwards. That's never going to get you anywhere. That was like, I sat there and like, way to kill aspiration for anyone starting in this business. Needless to say, I considered it a bad advice at the time, and I'm still kicking upwards a lot. Fortunately, I had been given one of the best advice I've been told by the time I then surpassed this person in rank at the BBC, which was, you have to remember those, you meet on the way up, because you will meet them on the way down. So in this industry where your reputation, the reputation of your organization, the reputation of your team is incredibly important, for you to not treat your staff with respect, no matter what rank they are, no matter where they are in the organization, I think always comes back to haunt you. And then if I can give one more good advice that I was given by, actually by Fiona Campbell, I'm sure she doesn't mind me kind of saying that if you went to a session, it's like, do you know what, if you're getting stuck somewhere, get the hell out of Dodge. And, and I think that definitely stood me in good stead. So don't wait for things to happen. Make it happen. Get out.
I'm trying to figure out whether this piece of advice that I actually just received yesterday, so it's I got an email yesterday, and it said, you cannot be everyone's champion. And I'm trying to figure out whether that's actually really brilliant advice or whether that's the worst thing I've ever heard. Because as a leader, like, I'm really trying to put myself in the position of where I was when I was working with my former boss and trying to forward my career. And I feel that now I have a lot more sympathy for the challenges that my former bosses would have had in trying to help me move forward and not stagnate, and always like try to give your employees the opportunities that they want. And now I feel more sympathy because I realize it's not as it's easier said than done. But the one thing that I do feel that I have succeeded at doing as someone who's managing people is being really, really transparent and honest when I can't do something for somebody. And that's what I would have loved to have got over the last 10 years when I went to my boss and I told them I really want to do this, or I haven't succeeded in doing this. I just felt like I was often fed a line. I was given like the company line, or it was framed to me in some kind of managerial speak, but it just wasn't really being honest and transparent. If they had just told me, we don't have the budget for that, or they, just explained the headcount or how much they wanted to help me forward my career and maybe help me think outside the box, I would have respected it a lot more. So that was, so I'm trying to figure out how can I be everyone's champion, and I haven't got the answer to that yet, and I'd love if we open it to the floor, if anyone has any thoughts on that, they can help me out or send me a tweet or something. The other thing I would say is one of the best pieces of advice I got was probably about 10 years into my career, and when I was in the BBC, I was presenting on the BBC World Service. And prior to that, I'd worked as a broadcaster in RTE, the national broadcaster in Ireland, Mark's former parish as well. And I used to be a newsreader. And the thing that my editor in the BBC said to me at the time when I was delivering links in the studio was, he was on talkback to me and was like, too newsy, and he would say things like that. And I had fallen into all of these really bad habits where I was trying to be someone that wasn't actually myself. And so, I reverted back to just who I am, which is a girl from the middle of Ireland, a small county called Longford. My accent has not changed. I think I tried to change it or to sound more authoritative. And really, that isn't really harboring authenticity. And I think that authenticity to who you are, you underestimate all of the qualities you have in your background. No matter how boring you might think they are, you actually bring them into your job and into your personality and into your relationships with other people every single day. So I think do not underestimate the value of those and the value of being yourself.
So my accent has changed because I'm from Sydney, Australia, and sometimes the Australian accent comes out. So, and for those of you who are in the know, I used to be a full-time ice hockey player, which is not the Australian national sport. Yeah, Mark just finds out right now. And I bring this up because I actually left Australia to go train full-time as an athlete in Canada, and there's one other Canadian ice hockey player here. So, and I bring this up because one of my coaches, who is the Canadian national team coach, she said to me that as a leader, your job is actually really easy because all you need to do is look after your team. You just have to give them your time and attention, because if you've hired correctly, you've already hired the best people that you can. You don't need to teach them what to do. They've already got the skills. You just need to give them time and attention. And the thing that took up most of her time was giving attention to her 22, 23 athletes. And that's a piece of advice that's held me in very good stead in whatever kind of capacity that I've had today. And of course, segue, which is you've all been in positions recently where you're building something new and you've hired teams. So Anne-Marie, you've mentioned before that you've had to work specifically with millennials and you're managing people who are younger than you. Matt, you started up something completely from scratch, uncharted waters, for an experiment that NBC wanted to do, and it's breaking all kinds of records as well. Inky, you've hired how many people? Like a lot, and you've had a nice little pot of money which to do that with. But then around you in the wider news ecosystem, things are shaking as well. They've shaken at CNN, they're shaking at BBC, they're shaking elsewhere, and even today when I was sitting in this session, Trunk's entire social media team has basically been wiped out. And then Mark, of course, you're starting a new adventure as well. So there's all these different shapes of building teams and hiring talent. And so that would be my next question, which is, what does your dream team look like? How do you hire talent? Mark, you have a reputation for really good hiring, especially from Storyful. Everyone who's from Storyful has gone on to do great things. So how do you spot that talent? How are you managing that talent? And also, how do you lead that team? I think we've touched on this a little bit before, but I'd like to go deeper.
It's hard to describe. It's like tying shoelaces, you know. I can show you how to do it, but I find it very hard to put it into words. And I think part of what the fundamental thing is, you hire people who will then hire other people. So, you know, I've had a few very, very good hires to begin with who made a statement about the company. The type of culture we were, there were people who were eloquent, could talk in public. Some of those people were literally people that I knew I wanted to hire, didn't hire them for 3 years. But I would work in them. Others were serendipitous. Adam Thomas, who's the head of the European Journalism Centre, we met having a coffee just out in the square at Perugia 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and after 10 minutes I just knew this guy was special. And 3 weeks later we were working together. There's just that moment of connection. What it all has to do with is a very, very strong idea of your intrinsic core value, which is as a person, as a leader, and then as an organization. If you start hiring to make up for the deficiencies in your organization, you will create, you'll harm your culture. So I give you an example. In Storyful, we were very strong editorially. Weren't so strong on the product side, but we had great, strong product leaders. We were terrible on the sales side. We could talk to you for hours about our product. You would think we were the fifth secret of Fatima. We were so brilliant and miraculous. We'd forget to close the sale. So we hired a guy who was a shit-kicking, badass software salesman who would literally bang down doors and literally smoke cigars. Because I thought we needed to make up for a thing that was missing in the team. That was the worst decision. Because the whole rest of the team were going, wait a minute, this person doesn't have any commitment to our culture, doesn't know where we're coming from. We know we need help here, but you're hiring people that are not like us. And so myself and Anya, when we were sitting down, Anya Kerr, who was a managing editor of Storyful, went on to Facebook to be head of journalism partnerships. I'm left brain, she's right brain. From the very beginning, we only had 3 people in this organization we've set up. We have built into the DNA all of the things we learned about culture. And we know as we hire people, they will fit right into the culture and they will start hiring other people. And this is what happens. You end up hiring people who hire other people, and before you know it, you're sitting around the room going, how the fuck did this happen? You really do, and it's the greatest joy of my professional life. And I have very little to do with it, except at the beginning. It comes back to advice. My best advice I was ever given as a journalist was make it sing. My first front page story in an Irish newspaper called the Sunday Business Post, and an editor came over and said, make it sing. And that's my best advice. So when you're building a team, tell them a story, make it sing, let them internalize it and give them power enough to go and make mistakes, give them the freedom, but always for them to know that if they need another $500,000 or they need you to go and battle for them, that you're the person to do that for them, and just let them do it. And then they'll sit in the bar with their mates going, you really should work here, it's brilliant. Or they'll meet someone at Perugia or they're at another conference and they say, you should come and work for Storyful or Neva Labs or CNN. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's about that essential core and about a real belief that together you can make it sing. You can do something that they'll always remember. So I can't claim credit for anyone ever doing anything brilliant after working for Storyful, but I think they all look back at the times we soldiered together and they felt they were doing something special with people that had a very clear culture. So the final thing I would say, sorry, I could go on for hours about this, but I remember the first day Storyful was used as an adjective. So I was in a meeting with the head of product and I said something about we should do something with the product to suit a client, and he said, that's not very Storyful. And everybody in the room knew exactly what he meant. He didn't have to say anything. And so you start speaking in shorthand about your company culture and everyone understands it, that's when you know there's the glue that starts to, keep people in the team and then also get people stuck in the team when they come in and they see you. The final thing, very practical, good internship programs, paid, by the way, paid internships programs, are the key to hiring the best people. Like one of the, Donny O'Sullivan's this great reporter for CNN now, he's breaking all the big stories and scoops. Like the guy's a cheeky little bastard from Cork. Like he gets up, but he's such a brilliant guy. He came in an internship program, and I remember Anya and Malachi Brown, who now works for the New York Times, when they were hiring him, turned down to each other and just said, yeah, this is the guy. And he came in for the internship program, and now he's literally changing the way we think about bots and trolls and stuff like that, and he's still a cheeky little guy from Cork. So they're a great way, I think, of giving yourself a sort of a limited liability to see if it fits right, but respect them by paying them is the key.
Yeah, he definitely is cheeky, but he is brilliant. We can definitely vouch for that. I mean, I agree with a lot of what Mark says. The only thing I would sort of add to that is that when I sort of started with a very sort of carte blanche and a little bit of money to kind of go out and do something, I think it's also really important, or it was important to me, I'm just going to talk from a very personal experience, but it was really important to me that I would find people who would make up for my own shortcomings, because the team is only as strong as the skills on your set on your team. So I really mapped out the skill sets that I felt were needed to push forward with the agenda that I wanted, that were needed to mask my own inability to do certain things, so that the team as a whole was really strong. So, I feel like I'm exceptionally lucky to have a team where I can pretty much call on somebody to do whatever it is that I need. I mean, we've got people who are really good at breaking the CMS when we need to. We've got people who are really good on the social side. We've got people who can do data. We can do people who can do interactive. And we specifically went out with that kind of thought process of like, let's not all hire in our own image. Let's kind of try to sort of strengthen the skill set of the team. And I would sort of argue, my team members who are here can maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I would argue that that has actually strengthened our team enormously, that we've had that ability to kind of do that. And actually sort of, we do paid internships, and they have massively paid off. We have people who have moved up through the ranks through that. We have, Tony came through a different internship, but we have people who are working on our team now who came in as interns who have been absolutely brilliant. And, and just because I have the floor, we are actually looking for a really good supervising editor now. So, if you want a job, please let us know.
I should also add, I'm looking for a deputy editor.
I just want money.
I'm cool. Oh, right.
Your turn.
Yeah, so, I think there's sort of two broad sweeping bits to this. The first is I completely agree with the adjective point that Mark brought up. When your name is used as an adjective, oh my God, it just feels so good. You just think that's like the first milestone. or at least it was our first. So, you know, I built this this small little digital documentary unit called Left Field in New York, and you know, what was really important for me is to just understand what sort of culture, identity, and unit I wanted to build before I started looking for anybody. It seems obvious, but I think there's a lot of corporate pressures that exist out there to move really quickly and execute quickly and hire immediately. And, you know, my reaction to that was just to push back as hard as humanly possible. And it's hard when you're entering a unit or a company. I've only been with NBC a little over a year, and so it's been really difficult to sort of push back when I was the new guy. But you have to in order to build something sustainable. Two, I think when you don't know how the market will fluctuate, i.e. the fall of Facebook, you have to diversify your portfolio, i.e. when you're hiring, it is not a good idea to sort of go in and say, all right, I'm going to select all features videographers or VJs and just go across the board with the same type of person, right? So I think the industry is just constantly in a state of flux. If we think that, you know, Facebook will even out and you know, and YouTube and all social was sort of steady at any point in our lifetimes, then we're, you know, again, we're lying through our teeth. I think that's just not going to happen. So when you're creating something, it's important to sort of think about diversifying your portfolio, but at the same time, how those positions relate to each other in whether it's an assembly line sort of format or something else. And so those have really, really paid off for us. You know, we've only been around for 9 months, and we're finding that NBC really, as it turns out, sees value in awards that we're winning. And so, you know, as we sort of continue to ramp up, I'm obviously going to sort of fuel that side of the team, and while I sort of run it like an incubator and trying to find, you know, where these other sort of bits sort of fit within the larger industry. And so those are the two bits that I found worked best for us.
I'm going to keep this one short. I just think that when you're hiring and creating a team, that the thing that strikes me that you really need is people that will fit into the culture, but also that they will have very clearly defined roles. And I don't mean prescriptive in how they do their roles, but I think if it's clearly defined as to what that person's purpose is there and how that fits within the wider ecosystem in your team and how they can lean on each other or possibly cross-pollinate, then you're going to have a much more motivated team who come in with a really strong sense of purpose. They know exactly what they need to contribute in the editorial meeting, and then they know if they need to lean on their other colleagues or share stories or pass one over to another colleague who might have a bit of crossover in the type of beat that they cover. And I find that in the team I'm with now, there are very clearly defined roles, so I know exactly if a story comes up, I know exactly which reporter I need to cover it. In the past, I've been on teams where, and I myself included, have gone in and I just thought, what am I actually doing here? You know, and I kind of thought, what is my purpose? And I think that that's really, really important. People need to know what they're signed up to do. Internships as well, I would say, definitely hiring people who know much more than you do. I have an intern who's in her early 20s and she knows so much about gaming and all sorts of other things about internet culture that I know nothing about. But I think it's just having the confidence to trust the people around you and learn from them and bring your experience then to the table when you need to.
Challenge you on that.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people like to say it. A lot of people like to talk the talk and say, "Oh, I'm going to hire people that are smarter than me." But in
I didn't say smarter. I think
or
that's
better than me.
Yeah.
Right.
Or I didn't say better.
Okay. Well, what did you say, Anne?
I said they have different skills and they have a different knowledge base. I think it's really important to surround yourself with people with a different knowledge base. I don't necessarily know everything. So, for example, I rely on other editors every day. If I'm doing a story about the transgender community, or I'm doing something with relation to, you know, the refugee crisis, I'll lean on our social good editor because this is something he's covering every day. If there's a story about, you know, an archaeological dig, some big find in Scotland, I'll still lean on the science editor. I'll just like lean on the people around me, you know, and be prudent about how you do that. I don't mean that, you know, you need to hire people that are better than you. You're in that position for a reason. You have obviously got a lot to contribute.
Yeah, so that's exactly the point that I think I'm trying to make, which is that it's very well and good to say that, but I have seen in a lot of organizations that people say that very smoothly, very nicely, but they're more interested in their own positions, and they will entrench themselves, and they won't hire those kinds of people that you were talking about. Mark?
Oh, Oh, that's because what? They feel threatened by it?
Yeah. You know, I think
I would say that
you'll only grow by being around people. It's like, I know this is such a cliche, but it's like, you know, if you play tennis with someone who's really good, you're going to get good. I was learning violin when I was 14 years old. I started really late, and about a year into me learning the violin, I was asked to join this Cayley band in the middle of Ireland by this priest in County Leitrim, because he found out that my great-granduncle was the composer of all of the music that we were playing. And so I was completely out of my depth, and I had no clue what I was doing, but I got really, really good really, really fast. And I know that that's a cheesy analogy, but it's true, it works.
I've a professional hockey player, violin player. I have no natural talent. So I have to make up for that deficiency with just being obsessive about acquiring knowledge. I think on the inverse side, I think sometimes smart people are overrated, right? I think people can be too smart. I've seen hiring policies, this is very, very prevalent in Silicon Valley, by the way, where they want people who are literally acknowledged, you know, experts in their field. And you've all seen the movie, the documentary about Enron, the smartest people in the room. I've been with the smartest people in the room. It's not a nice place to be, because they all hate each other. They all essentially have no curiosity, because they all know they know everything. They're not agile. They want you to know they know everything, so therefore they're not good at being challenged. They don't develop good critical feedback loops, which are all the things that power innovation, because innovation is all about this idea of learning through critical feedback. And smart people sometimes don't have that gene or that strand in their DNA. You can teach them, but what tends to happen sometimes, a manager, and I distinguish from a leader, a manager tends to spend too much time on their overachieving people and not enough time on good but could be better people. And so I think sometimes smart people, you know, ultimately are not nice to work with, and you tend to know them by their LinkedIn profiles, because they've had the top job in like 5 different places. Although I'm looking at myself, and I think I have 5 jobs in 5 different places. So I wouldn't even hire myself. But the point I'm trying to really make is that you've got to realize that sometimes your company's probably, your team is probably broken into 3 broad strands. The absolutely overachieving, excellent people, some of them who are good you want to keep, a chunk of really good people who could be better, and then a bunch of toxic people down the bottom who you can't lead out of that state. They're either in the wrong place and they should go somewhere else, or they're just toxic people. And it's the top 2 that get most attention from bad managers. Good leaders understand that they should be constantly on letting people make their own mistakes, having good feedback loops. I think we can learn bad things from Silicon Valley, very bad things, and I hope we can talk about that. But good thing we can learn is agile methodology as applied to editorial newsrooms. There's a beautiful marriage with stand-ups. I think, Matt, your point about that meeting on the Monday morning should be very casual, into your week ahead, and then teams of multidisciplinary groups together taking 2 weeks to do something quick, fail quick. If something's not working, kill it quickly. And that's another thing as well. So that doesn't have, smart people don't really like that kind of system.
It depends what your definition of smart is as well, and also like what you're saying there about you know, their CVs. I think that it's a fallacy to hire someone just based on their CV and how much they know. You know, it's well recognised that, or I think there's been a long-standing tradition at least of hiring someone because they fit the job spec exactly, and I think that's a really big mistake. We should be hiring people based on the potential, or whether they have skills that are not necessarily directly related to what we want to do, but they can be transferred over, and I think that that's something we should really embrace. You know, hiring on potential and developing somebody.
One thing I just add, I think Anne-Marie made a great point about targets and role definition. I think having the right KPI in your newsroom so people all can see how they succeed against their own measurement. And measurement of success, I think, is where you sort out the difference between what I'm talking about, the negative people and the positive people. So clear KPIs or OKRs or whatever you call them.
I just one comment on that. I think top talent requires top demand, right? And I think what I have found over and over and over again is, you know, the asks that will come to you as a result of hiring extraordinarily talented or smart individuals. You know, it's always a good idea to hire smart people, but it isn't always a good idea to have a full team of extraordinarily experienced top talent, because you'll just end up sending emails apologizing on their behalfs for the rest of your life. But you know, I think what is really important is to hire somebody who is extraordinarily skilled, and hire them first, right? Because that then alerts everyone else in the industry that you just hired this amazing person whose eyes, or who has a ton of eyeballs on them, and that then attracts two different types of people. Individuals who are of equal talent to that person, who might be buddy-buddy with them, but also, and more importantly, fresh, green journalists who are looking to one day be that person, and men are willing to do anything to get there. And those are the people that you want, actually, because they will help your unit grow past that starting block. Again, like these awards and it only go so far, and if you're looking to create a sustainable company, you need a ton of those 23, 24, and 25-year-olds.
So I'm going to go into a little bit more kind of deeper, serious territory. In a previous, it's all been fun and games until now. So in a previous version of this panel, one of the questions that we asked was, what is the most difficult thing that you've had to do as a leader? And Hernando Alvarez, who is an editor at the BBC, who also wanted to be here, but it's his father's 80th birthday, so he couldn't join. And I'm sure he won't mind me sharing the story. So he was told that at the BBC, he was sent along to some kind of counseling training. And his attitude at the beginning was, oh, I don't want to go. This is such a waste of time. Why am I here? He went into the training, was playing with his phone the whole time, looking at the emails coming through, but then decided, you know what, I'm here. I'm actually going to sit down and pay attention and hope I can learn something. So it was a grief and counseling training. A few weeks later, if I remember the story correctly, he was posted in South America somewhere, and one of his team members came up to him and told him that she wanted to kill herself. And because of the training he had on that one day, he knew exactly how to talk to this person. And as a result, nothing bad happened. There were no negative consequences. And that person since has gone on, had a great career. And he credits back to this training that he was very reluctant to go to at the start. So the question that I wanted to ask you guys, which is where the story came from, was what is the toughest thing that you've had to do as a leader? Can you talk about it, and also any learnings or experience that came from it? So I'll ask Inki and Anne-Marie first, because we've already been through that question. It gives you guys a bit of time to think about it.
God, I'm thinking here again. There's a few. Do you want to go first, Inki?
Yeah, I mean, I, for me, hands down, the hardest thing you have to do is fire people. It's because not only are you you might be doing it for all the best business reasons, and you even tell yourself that it's best for them, but they have mortgages, families. There's massive consequences beyond what you see to fire people, especially if you have to fire them for gross misconduct or anything that has affected the business. So, for me, hands down, dealing with very drawn-out, protracted process along those lines has been the hardest thing I've had to do. I've been lucky not to have to do it too many times, but when I have, it's taken a huge toll in terms of my sort of, my own sort of personal capital and just all my leadership skills, I would say.
Just to add to that, I haven't had to fire anyone yet, thankfully. But I have been in a company that's gone through a period of change. So recently, Mashable was acquired at the end of the year, and so there were job losses, there were redundancies, including in the UK team, not specifically on my editorial team, but on the commercial side. So I have been, part of an interesting time in a company when it's weathering the storm. And I think that trying to provide positive leadership during that time to create a sense of opportunity and create a perception that there is an opportunity in this period of change has been challenging. But the other thing I would say is that I think acknowledging that human beings come into the workforce as people, and there will be all sorts of things that will trigger things that may have happened in their life when they're covering stories. And one of the things that happened to me was I was working with one of my interns, it was about a year ago, and she was writing up a story about a Netflix series that was all about eating disorders. But I could see that she was getting very, very distressed, and I ended up having a very personal conversation with her where she told me very personal details about her own experience with eating disorders. And I think that, the duty of care that you need to exercise when you're dealing with those kind of situations. It was like where Hernando, obviously not as an extreme situation, but you don't expect to find yourself having those kind of conversations on your day-to-day, very personal situations. So I didn't exactly like have anything in a book as to what to do, but my response was just a very human one, you know, and very caring and listening. And I think listening is one of the things that we actually find really hard to do. If you're having a conversation with someone and you try not to talk or even say, it's really, really hard. So you're doing a really good job, Esra. And listening, and then, you know, knowing when to say something and when just to listen, because sometimes that's all you need to do.
Yeah, there's a strange thing happening at the moment, I think, in workplaces where we're trying to make workplaces so perfect, you know, and a lot of us to do with the foosball culture of stocked fridges and all that stuff we see in Silicon Valley, and that makes it more difficult to deal with. The one thing about leadership I found more difficult, that is when things are just so glaringly traumatic for a person in a perfect environment, that it's quite strange how leaders have to deal with that. And so it goes back to, I was a foreign correspondent, a war correspondent, so the best difficult thing I ever did in my life was have to turn around to seeing the camera people or whoever, 5 or 6 people, and say, I remember in South Lebanon in 2006 having to decide to drive down a road and having a pretty clear idea of the fraction of a chance that someone in the team will be hurt or killed, because these raiders are bombing cars periodically. And having to take that decision, say, okay, we're going to drive. And it turned around to everybody and go, are we all okay with this? Now, clearly, I'm the correspondent, so I get on television. I look like I'm taking a big risk. And I did that a couple of times. And in 1-2 cases, people said they wouldn't go with me. And that was great. So then it was weird when I got into a situation in Storyful, where I thought we had the perfect workplace, it was all fine. We were the kind of first line of defense against the first wave of beheading videos and gruesome stuff coming out of what, you know, was the Arab Spring and became the uprisings. And we had to think about trauma, vicarious trauma. So here I was as a former foreign correspondent thinking, these people are well fed, well taken care of, they've got to see a few videos, couldn't be that bad. We started to see the signs of vicarious trauma, and thankfully Bruce Shapiro from the Dart Center, who's here actually at Perugia, you should really check out the work that's been done on protecting your own journalists in an organization against vicarious trauma. It can happen from covering things like refugee crisis. You don't see it, it happens. It's not traditional PTSD. Dealing with that is very similar to what you said, Amory. I think you have to understand that it's the most difficult thing to give meaning to a person who's just seen something that is just obscene or completely out of kilter with their normal life. How do you do it? And so a couple of times, like in Twitter, I remember we had a terrible atrocity in Nice. If you remember, a bus drove into a crowd full of people on the Corniche, and I knew that a lot of our sales team from France were from Nice, and having to go in and speak publicly in front of the team to give meaning to this meaningless thing, I found it was the most difficult thing, and it was the single most important thing I ever dealt with. And periodically, people will have bereavement, just something will happen that's completely out of kilter what the reality of the workplace you've tried to create it. And how you deal with that, with empathy, understanding not what they're doing and why they're feeling it, is so different from a manager who I used to get people ring me up in the war zone and go, take care of yourself. I'm like, fuck, am I going to take care of myself? And it was their way of kind of, well, I told him to take care of himself. And you'd have insurance rules that made us go on these combat environment courses where they'd hire special forces to teach us how to treat a, sucking chest wound because the insurance box has to be ticked. And we knew they didn't care, really. They were ticking a box. But really being a good leader means when someone is in that moment, just finding a way to give that moment meaning with an authenticity that makes them walk away not feeling necessarily any better, but just knowing that someone out there is in their thoughts.
I think feeling that's acknowledged. I actually was one of those people who had PTSD or trauma after the Paris attacks. I'd been asked to come into the BBC and watch all of the user-generated content, and I literally spent about 14 hours piecing through all of the various attacks and who was the first eyewitness and using geolocation tools, and spent all of the many hours compiling it all for one of the current affairs programmes in the BBC. And that was on the Saturday. And then I came back in on the Monday and I was about to write a blog for BBC Trending. And I kept going I started the first few sentences and I kept going into the ladies' toilets and I just could not stop crying because I'd gone into the people's Twitter pages and then tried to verify them and saw the pictures with their families and then saw obviously a lot of gruesome things online and felt this huge sense of responsibility to write something that would do them justice. And so I told my editor, a guy called Mukul Devachand, who both Matt and I have worked with, and you've worked with as well, and the level of, and Inky has worked with as well. Mark, have you worked with Mukul? And
I wish I had.
The level of compassion with which he treated me, I felt so stupid. I felt like, oh my God, why am I getting upset? I've just been looking at this thing online. I've not been there. And what he said to me was, you know, that journalists who are dealing with content online often encounter even more gruesome things than you might even see when you're on the front line, because it might possibly be more contained when you're, you know, on location or on the ground. And so he said, you know, you were even more likely to experience PTSD. So I went away, gave my notes to another reporter, and they wrote them up for me. I just couldn't do it. And I just felt really grateful to have had an editor who totally understood at that time and knew exactly the right thing to say in that situation.
I think for me, it's actually the thing that came to mind the most was something that's happening right now. And that is one of our journalists did this half-hour documentary on the drug war in the Philippines. And we had him inside of a morgue, and he was watching dead bodies come in to the morgue, and he was filming them and waiting for the families to then come in and recognize dead bodies. And this is how we started the reporting there, by then tapping the families on the shoulder, you know, hours later, and saying, hey, you know, do you mind if we talk to you about who this person was, and so on and so forth. And the reporting, which lasted a month in Manila, sort of followed suit every single day. And so a reporter would call me every day, and we'd sort of talk about what he was doing. And he seemed fine. And he came back, and then we started editing together, and we were looking at images of this morgue and of these dead bodies. I mean, it was for months, every day, you know, and it just ticked on and ticked on. And he wrapped up that edit, and then got immediately onto a story that's dropping on Tuesday, hint, hint, half-hour story, that is it is the craziest story I have ever been a part of. We're embedded with a very interesting and very dangerous group, and he's been on this now for 6 months, and we've been looking at the edit off and on for about 4 of those 6 months, just sort of witnessing a lot of gruesome speech and images. And I have to say that, like, one of the hardest things to recognize was also my own sort of failing was recognizing how traumatic it had been to me and how traumatic it had been to my employee, because we're just so excited to be doing this level of reporting and really impactful journalism that I don't think that I realized that the conversations that we were having were just horribly dark. I mean, when people here, if you've dealt with this type of footage or this type of reporting, you know the deal. I mean, it becomes commonplace to sort of see these images and talk about the material in such a way that's unnatural. And I think
Sorry to interrupt.
I was just going to say that for me, that was recognizing that was happening was very difficult, and I'm still only recognizing it now, and that sort of coincided with another sort of difficult time that I've had to manage through, and that is the crisis that happened at NBC. I'm not sure if anybody here in Europe is familiar with the Today Show, but one of the hosts of a program at NBC, his workplace conduct was put into question, and he was fired. And I was just bringing people on board, really radical, rebellious individuals in their 20s and 30s, who really question the system quite a lot, and trying to convince them to work for this corporation when this person had just done this horrible thing. It was very difficult, and I found that, we sort of put our trust, luckily, in sort of upper tier management, and everything worked out. But it was difficult, and so those two things sort of happening at the same time was my most difficult time.
So I have a very kind of short follow-up question before we open it up. So Mark, you mentioned at the beginning about being a sponge of anxiety, of being the kind of leader who protects your team from the blows, who I guess would do all of the politics for everybody so that they could just get on and do with their job. So we've heard 4 kind of different, or 5 even different examples of difficult things. How do you guys deal with this when you go home at the end of the day? That's not easy to process. What is your coping mechanisms? I mean, and I'm asking this question because we are all human at the end of the day, and we do have our feelings involved. I don't think we'd be industry if we didn't care about what we were doing, and so we're prepared to deal with the negative as we are with the positive as well. So how do you deal with it?
So I was talking last night at dinner with Anthony Feinstein, he's a psychologist and he's examined trauma in journalism, and I was just saying to him how, how can we prepare people to, go into the field and be more able to withstand PTSD? And he said, you guys are rock climbers. You're thrill seekers. That's what's brilliant about you. And what it occurs to me sometimes is the reason journalism is so attractive to us, I think, is because we've got to do the hard things. We've got to knock on the door of a bereaved family and ask them to give us meaning to what happened and collect. My first job in journalism was in Belfast. I had to go to funerals and cover the funeral, and I have to literally go all the way to the graveside. And we do things so other people don't have to do them. And so the way I deal with it is realizing I just make my peace with the fact that it's not going to be easy, and it's not. It's deeply traumatic to be a leader sometimes. It's deeply personal. Don't ever let anyone tell you that it's not personal. It is all in your head. Leadership, again, self-awareness, self-regulation, empathy. So what I've tended to do over the years is not seek any silver bullet. There is no silver bullet that makes it easy to put up with all this trauma and the burden of leadership. The way you do it is you break it up into pieces. So I know this sounds really utilitarian, but I think about exercise, I think about mindfulness, and I don't just mean meditation, I mean every day being aware of yourself, to know when you can feel that anger in your voice and you're saying something to somebody that's going to make them feel demoralized. I also very big believer in just the basics like sleep, just watching yourself, your physical health, and then your mental health takes care of it. And I talk about it in increments of maybe 5, 10, 15%. I think I'm now about probably 35, 40% more resilient than I was when I first did a startup. And when people ask me about why I did a second startup, I say it's like you jump into the water on a warm day, but the water is freezing cold, and you're paralyzed because it's so cold. When you do it a second time, you jump into the water, you know how cold it's going to be, and you're prepared for it. The water doesn't get any warmer, and I think resilience is all about just incrementally picking up things about your routine, being mindful of your emotions, regulating yourself better, being conscientious. I think it's very good for every leader to do these Myers-Briggs tests. I don't put a huge amount of store in them, but these psychometric tests that allow you to identify places where you are naturally weak and improve upon them. In my case, things like conscientiousness, discipline, execution, attention to detail. And I've just spent a lot of time working with coaches on those areas that I'm not good at while taking care of myself personally. And together, in aggregate, I now feel I'm now enjoying things a lot more, than I was, even though they can still be as tough as they ever were. But and I'm 50 in September, so it's not like I've suddenly had an overnight conversion to peace and tranquility. But it's much I'm enjoying it a lot more than I used to, and I think it's down to just small things. And also, finally, friends, support. Just having people you can walk home to, your wife, your partner, your husband. You can sit down and just say, this was a shitty day. That's it.
Also, Instagram accounts full of puppies work really well. That's my number one.
Otherwise, stay away from Instagram. Do you want me to add? Yeah, I agree with everything you've just said, Mark, actually. And I think, looking after yourself and sleeping, and I do a lot of yoga. I try to do yoga before I go into work in the morning. And I feel like on those days I do drag myself up out of bed before 6 a.m., I feel so much more focused before going in to meet my team. And then, recognizing your failings or potential weaknesses too, and trying to be aware of those things is really important. But one thing I would say about myself, and something I've noticed in a lot of journalists, is that we have a tendency to allow our profession to define us. And I think it's very easy to allow your job to become the definition of who you are. It's very difficult not to do that, and I think it's really important to have other things that also are part of who you are, not just your job.
Inky, anything to add?
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of that. Looking after yourself, going home at like 5 or 6 or something, not to stay in the office like too late, because that's a sure sign of burnout. But, if you can go home and literally switch off, don't go home and, in my case, switch on CNN, that's like, it's just like confounding the thing. So, but I guess for me, I try to look after myself, go to the gym and all those sort of things. But I also I hang out with my kids. They ground things. You know, it's amazing what they can do for you, and you know, losing a few times in some board game, it puts it all into perspective that you still lose to a 10-year-old, so that works for me.
So we can get some really quick questions in. We have a question at the back. I'm not as cool as Jeff Jarvis, so I can't bring you a microphone, but a microphone is coming to you. And then, so we'll go one in the back, and we just take the questions first, and then we'll go for answers. So in the back, and then over here on the side.
Hello, my name is Douwe. I'm a journalism educator. Thanks for this session. It's the best of the day for me so far. I have a question about the development of personal and professional identity, which is a big theme for us at the J School I'm teaching at. And I see a great need for coaching young professionals, especially in the first 5 years of their career. And my question to you is, what do you do more on a day-to-day basis? You told a little bit about trauma and the bigger themes, but what do you do on a day-to-day basis to shape young professionals in their personal and professional identity?
And then can we just take the second question and then we'll answer it?
So you've all talked about how change is constant. So my question is about how you make sure that your teams are adaptive and learning and ready basically for change when it comes.
Okay, so question one is, I think, more about kind of skills and getting prepared, and number two is about change. So whoever wants to jump in. We've got 2 minutes, by the way.
Oh, right. I mean, how I make sure I sort of am looking after each individual on a daily basis is I have lunches with them, and they're just rotating lunches. And whether they like it or not, I suspect they don't. But regardless, I make sure that to sort of just catch some FaceTime over lunch, you know, at least once a month with each individual, and then beyond that, I talk to them and review every story that they produce, or I try to, and catch FaceTime that way. So that's how I help mold people daily.
I actually find that the stronger your personal relationship is with your team, the better the stories you're going to come up with, because you might just be chatting about like some dinner party you're at and something that come up in conversation over the weekend. Those are the type of things that actually have led to some of the best features in original journalism on my team, and it's because I have a good personal rapport with the team. And also I think just taking the time, as Matt said, we often have a big focus on process, and in my case, you know, publishing, there's this constant churn, or trying to get the publishing going and making sure we have enough articles done, and, you know, making sure we're doing long form reporting as well. That's the process as well. But, you know, spending the time, and actually spending time with people one-on-one can sometimes be overlooked or deprioritized. I think that's really, really important, because that's often like what leads to strengthening your relationship on an ongoing basis, so that when it comes to an annual review, you're not just finding out stuff that happened 6 months ago. You actually have been talking every week, so none of these things come as a surprise.
I'm getting the time cut-off signal, but I'm going to pretend I didn't see that. So Mark and Inki, go.
Well, why don't we take number 2 question then, about the shaping the, you know, preparing your team for constant change. I mean, I think that transparency is a big part of that. I mean, I'm not saying share everything with your team, because then you just become muddled, and, you know, but share the things that you know and the things that are going to happen, you know. So if you have your weekly, monthly meeting or whatever it is, make sure that they know, here's where the budget is, here's where we are on sponsorship, here's what's happening to the team, here's what I know what's happening in other teams, you know. I mean, I have a meeting with them where they throw questions at me, and I try to answer them as honestly as I can, and then lie down in a darkened room afterwards. But, you know, I think that, you know, it is really important that they understand the media landscape, understand the things that you're dealing with, and even sometimes just telling them, here are the things that I'm working on right now. I will come back to you when I'm finished, you know, and having that open and candor, and, you know, and I mean, to be honest, I mean, you know, I think being a leader is also to put some responsibility on them, saying, do you know what? Go and read the industry papers. Go and look at what's happening. It's not different in our organizations than anywhere else. So I have some expectations of them as well, to be following up with what's happening, and even alerting me to some of them.
Right, 30 seconds. Wayne Gretzky, the great hockey player, said, go where the puck is going, not where it is. So it's all about knowing where your business is going and having your people think about that all the time. The best way of doing it is not to have them think about your product, but to be thinking about your user. So it's not about your product, it's about the thing that it helps your user solve. So when you build that into your, hardwire into every process, you start to think about the user first, And that allows you to be thinking about where the user is next, because there's going to be some 22-year-old millennial goes and laughs at you when you say Instagram, and they will know the next platform that's coming out of China that's going to change everything. So that's the concept of building change into the organization in such a way that allows you to develop products that solve user problems. And I think one trick that Anya has taught me she went to this great course in Columbia last year, the view from the balcony. Get your people in a room together and say, we're all the CEO, we're all up on the balcony looking down, what do you see? It's a chastening experience for a CEO because they basically tell you you're generally crap. And it's a great way of 360. You get to hear what they're thinking and they get to say what they want to hear. But the most important thing is, it's the great old Heisenberg principle. Don't look at the object, look at its momentum. And that's the key to handling change.
Great people, great panel, great questions, great session. Thank you.